By the winter of 1884, everyone in Grimes County, Texas, knew that freedom on paper didn't always mean freedom in practice. 20 years after the war had ended and the chains had supposedly broken, there were still places in East Texas where black folks worked land they didn't own, ate food they didn't choose, and lived in cabins they couldn't leave without permission. The Ashford place was one of those. Perched on a bluff above the muddy Navasota River, the sprawling ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of pine and scrubland, and somewhere in the middle of all that land, barely visible from the main road, sat a cluster of weathered shacks where 37 black workers lived under a system that everyone called sharecropping, but that felt, looked, and operated exactly like slavery, with a different name written on top. Before dawn breaks, 3 generations of women, a grandmother, a mother, and a child, will walk into the Texas darkness with nothing but each other and a growing certainty that something is hunting them through the trees. So, subscribe now, hit like, if you're ready for a story that'll keep you up tonight, and comment where you're watching from, because what stalked them in 1884 wasn't just men with guns. In the smallest shack on the eastern edge of the compound, 3 women prepared for a journey none of them had chosen, but all of them knew was coming. The oldest was Ruth, 71 years old, born into slavery in Mississippi in 1813, and bearing on her back the raised scars of 100 lashings from 100 different masters who'd owned her across 5 decades. Her daughter Celia was 46, born on a Louisiana plantation in 1838, and sold away from her mother at age 12, only to be reunited after the war, when both women, newly freed and searching, had found each other through the networks of churches and freedmen's bureaus that helped scattered families piece themselves back together. And the youngest was May, Celia's daughter, just 11 years old, born in 1873 in a moment when freedom still felt like a promise someone might actually keep. May had never known chains, but she'd known the exhaustion of picking cotton from dawn to dusk for pennies that never quite covered what the Ashfords claimed they owed for rent, for food, for tools, for the privilege of living on land that used to belong to people who looked like her until white men with guns and laws had taken it and called the taking progress. Ruth had been the first to say it out loud 3 nights earlier, sitting on the splintered porch step while Celia mended a dress by lamplight and May dozed against her mother's shoulder. Ruth had looked out at the dark line of pines beyond the compound and said, voice low and certain, that they needed to leave. Not next month, not next week, now. Celia had looked up sharply, needle frozen mid-stitch, and asked why now, what had changed. Ruth's answer had been simple and terrifying, because Thomas Ashford, the ranch owner's youngest son, had started watching May the way men watch things they intended to take. May was 11, Thomas was 23, and Ruth had lived long enough to know exactly how that story ended, if they stayed. Celia's hands had tightened on the dress, knuckles going pale. She'd asked where they would go, how they would survive, what they would do if the Ashfords came after them. Ruth had said she didn't know where they'd go, but anywhere was better than here. As for the Ashfords coming after them, well, they'd been running from white men with guns their whole lives. One more time wouldn't kill them, or if it did, at least they'd die free. The plan had come together in whispers over the next 2 days. They'd leave on Saturday night, when the Ashfords went into town for the weekly gathering at the church social, a raucous affair that usually involved enough whiskey that the white folks wouldn't notice 3 black women missing until Sunday morning at the earliest. They'd take nothing but what they could carry: a blanket, some cornbread, a canteen, a knife Celia had been hiding under a loose floorboard for years. They'd head north following the river at first, and then cutting east toward Louisiana, where Ruth said she still had distant family, people who might take them in, or at least point them further along. It wasn't much of a plan. It barely qualified as a plan at all, but it was the only one they had, and the alternative was watching May become another casualty of a system that claimed to be dead but still fed on black bodies whenever it got hungry. Saturday came with a grey, heavy sky that promised rain, but hadn't delivered yet. The Ashfords loaded into their wagon just after sunset, Thomas sitting in the back with his brothers, eyes scanning the compound one last time before the wagon rattled down the rutted drive and disappeared into the dusk. Ruth watched them go from the narrow gap in the door, counting to 100 after they vanished from sight, then counting to 100 again, just to be sure. When she finally nodded, Celia wrapped the blanket around May's shoulders, tucked the cornbread into a cloth sack, and the 3 of them slipped out the back of the shack and into the gathering dark. They moved quickly and quietly, Ruth leading despite her age, her body remembering the rhythms of flight from decades past. Celia in the middle with May's small hand clasped tight in hers, and May bringing up the rear, eyes wide, but mouth pressed into a determined line that made her look older than 11, made her look like someone who understood that this was life or death, and there was no room for childhood anymore. The compound fell away behind them, swallowed by distance and the thickening night. Ahead, the pines rose like black teeth against a purple sky. Ruth led them along a narrow deer path she'd been studying for weeks, a thread of packed earth that wound through the scrub and into the forest, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, 3 long notes that hung in the stillness. May stumbled once over an exposed root, but Celia caught her before she fell, and they kept moving, deeper into the trees, further from the only home May had ever known. Ruth didn't let them stop until they'd been walking for what felt like an hour, but was probably less. When she finally called a halt, they were standing in a small clearing ringed by towering pines, the ground carpeted in needles, the sky above them a narrow circle of stars. They drank from the canteen, ate a few bites of cornbread, and stood in silence, listening. There were no sounds of pursuit yet, no dogs, no shouts, no hoofbeats, just the forest breathing around them and the faint murmur of the river somewhere to their left. Celia asked Ruth if she thought they'd made it out clean. Ruth said she didn't know, that the Ashfords might not notice until morning, or they might notice the moment they got back and find the shack empty. Either way, they couldn't count on much of a head start. They needed to keep moving through the night, put as much distance as they could between themselves and the ranch before the sun came up. May asked in a small voice if they were going to be okay. Celia crouched down and cupped May's face in her hands and said yes, they were going to be okay, because they had each other and that was all they needed. Ruth didn't contradict her even though she knew better. She'd seen too many families torn apart, too many children lost, too many good plans go wrong to believe in guarantees, but she also knew that hope was sometimes the only weapon you had, and you wielded it until it broke or until it saved you. They started walking again, Ruth in the lead, following the sound of the river through the dark. Behind them, the clearing emptied. The pines swayed. The owl called again, and something else, something neither human nor quite animal, something that had been watching them since they left the compound, began to follow. At first, none of them noticed. They were too focused on the path, on not twisting an ankle, on listening for dogs and horses. But as they walked, Ruth began to feel it, a prickling at the back of her neck, a sense of being observed that she hadn't felt since her years running through Louisiana swamps with dogs on her heels. She slowed, turning her head slightly, listening. The forest was too quiet. The crickets that had been chirping when they entered the clearing had gone silent. The frogs that usually sang near the river had stopped. The only sound was their own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles under their feet. Ruth stopped walking entirely. Celia nearly ran into her back and hissed what was wrong. Ruth held up a hand for silence and stood there, straining her ears, her old eyes scanning the dark shapes of the trees. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of something moving through the underbrush parallel to them, maybe 30 yards to their right. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a hog. It was too deliberate, too steady. It was the sound of something pacing them, matching their speed, staying just out of sight. Celia heard it too. Her grip on May's hand tightened until the girl whimpered. Ruth turned and looked at them both, her face carved into hard lines by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. She said quietly that they needed to move faster. Celia asked if it was the Ashfords. Ruth said no, the Ashfords would have brought dogs and lanterns, would have been shouting by now. This was something else. What? She didn't know. But they weren't going to wait around to find out. She adjusted the sack on her shoulder and started walking again. Faster now, no longer worrying about silence, just speed. Celia and May followed, half running, stumbling over roots and rocks in the dark. The sound in the trees kept pace. Sometimes it fell behind, sometimes it drew closer, but it never went away. May started to cry, quiet, hiccuping sobs that she tried to muffle against her mother's side. Celia whispered fiercely that it was going to be okay, that whatever it was just an animal, maybe a wolf or a bobcat, and as long as they kept moving, it wouldn't attack. Ruth didn't say anything, but her hand found the knife tucked into her belt, fingers closing around the handle, and she kept walking, faster and faster, until they were nearly running through the black forest with something unseen running alongside them, matching every step. They broke out of the trees onto the riverbank, just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The Navasota stretched before them, a wide dark ribbon reflecting the cloud-choked sky. On the far side, more forest. No lights, no signs of civilization. Just wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. Ruth turned and looked back at the tree line they'd just emerged from. For a moment she saw nothing. Then between two massive pines, something moved. It was too large to be a wolf, too upright to be a bear. It stood there, just inside the shadows, and Ruth could feel its eyes on her even though she couldn't make out its face. The rain came harder, cold and stinging. Ruth grabbed Celia's arm and pulled her toward the water, saying they needed to cross now. Celia stared at the river, at the current moving fast and dark, and said they'd drown. Ruth said they'd drown, or they'd stay and face whatever was in those trees, and she knew which one she preferred. May was shaking, her small body drenched and trembling. Ruth knelt in front of her and said they were going to walk across holding hands, that the water wouldn't be deeper than their waists if they stayed on the sandbars, and that May just needed to trust her grandmother the way she'd trusted her this far. May nodded, teeth chattering. The three women waded into the Navasota River, hand in hand, while behind them on the bank the thing in the trees stepped forward into the rain and watched them go. The water was colder than Ruth had expected, a shock that stole her breath and made her old joints scream in protest. But she kept moving, one careful step at a time, her free hand held out for balance, her other hand gripping Celia's so hard her knuckles ached. The current tugged at their skirts, trying to pull them downstream, trying to knock them off their feet. May gasped when the water reached her chest, her small body lifting slightly, buoyant and terrifying. Celia hauled her back down with a grunt, telling her to keep her feet on the bottom, to lean into the current, to not let go no matter what. They were halfway across when May screamed, not a scream of fear exactly, but of shock and pain. Something had brushed against her leg under the water, something solid and moving with purpose. Celia yanked May closer, scanning the dark surface of the river, but the rain was falling too hard now to see anything clearly. Ruth hissed at them to keep moving, that whatever was in the water with them was less dangerous than what was on the bank behind them. They pushed forward, the three of them locked together, moving as one stumbling, gasping organism through the Navasota's cold grip. When Ruth's foot finally found the rising sandbar on the far side and the water began to shallow, she nearly sobbed with relief. They dragged themselves up onto the opposite bank, collapsing in the mud and grass, chests heaving, clothes plastered to their bodies, rain hammering down on their heads. For a long moment, none of them moved. They just lay there, catching their breath, listening to the roar of the rain and the rush of the river. Then Ruth forced herself up onto her hands and knees and looked back across the water. The far bank was lost in shadow and rain, but she could still feel it, that presence watching from the trees. She couldn't see it anymore, but it was there. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat, the way she'd known danger her entire life. Celia sat up, wringing water from May's hair, checking the girl for injuries. May's leg had a long, shallow scratch from knee to ankle, something sharp under the water, a submerged branch maybe, or something else. Celia tore a strip from her already ruined skirt and wrapped it around the wound, tying it tight. May didn't complain. She just stared across the river with wide, unblinking eyes, and Ruth recognized that look. It was the look of someone who'd just crossed a line they could never uncross, who'd just learned that the world was bigger and stranger and more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Ruth had worn that look herself once, a lifetime ago, and she'd carry it to her grave. Now May would carry it too. That was the price of freedom sometimes. You paid for it with your innocence. They couldn't stay on the riverbank. The rain was coming down in sheets now, cold and relentless, and hypothermia was as real a threat as anything stalking them through the forest. Ruth hauled herself to her feet, joints protesting, and pulled Celia and May up after her. She said they needed to find shelter, somewhere dry where they could rest until the storm passed and the sun came up. Celia asked where, because there was nothing out here but trees, and more trees. Ruth said they'd walk until they found something, a cave, a rock overhang, an abandoned trapper's shack, anything with a roof. They started moving again, slower now, exhaustion dragging at their limbs like chains. The forest on this side of the river was different from the one they'd left behind. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thicker, their branches hanging low and heavy with Spanish moss that dripped rain like grey curtains. The underbrush was thicker too, brambles and thorns that caught at their skirts and scratched their arms. Ruth led them along what looked like an old game trail, barely visible in the dark, winding between massive pines and overfallen logs slick with rot. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably less, time stretching and compressing in the disorienting way it did when you were cold and scared and running on nothing but adrenaline. It was May who spotted the structure first. She pointed with one shaking hand and said in a voice barely louder than a whisper that there was something up ahead. Ruth and Celia stopped and looked where she was pointing. Through the rain and the dark, barely visible between the trees, was the outline of a small building. Not a house, exactly. More like a shed or a storage shack, half collapsed on one side, the roof sagging dangerously, but it had walls. It had a door. It was shelter. Ruth approached it cautiously, knife in hand, ready for anything. But when she pushed the door open, the only thing that greeted her was the smell of old wood and mildew and the faint, sour tang of something that had died in here a long time ago. The interior was small and cramped, barely big enough for the three of them to lie down, but it was dry, or at least drier than outside. Ruth stepped in, testing the floorboards, making sure they wouldn't collapse under their weight. They held. She motioned for Celia and May to come in. The three women crowded into the tiny space, pulling the door shut behind them, and for the first time since they'd left the Ashford place, they allowed themselves to stop moving. They sat with their backs against the wall, shoulder to shoulder, shivering in their wet clothes, listening to the rain drum on the roof above their heads. Celia pulled May onto her lap and wrapped the damp blanket around both of them, trying to trap what little body heat they had left. May's teeth chattered so hard Ruth could hear them clicking. She needed to get the girl warm, or they'd lose her to fever before morning. Ruth fumbled in the dark for the sack of cornbread, which was soaked through and falling apart, but she pressed a piece into May's hand anyway and told her to eat. May took a small bite, then another, mechanically chewing and swallowing. Celia ate too, though she looked like she might be sick. Ruth forced herself to eat as well, even though her stomach churned with exhaustion and fear. They needed the calories. They needed the strength, because whatever had followed them to the river wasn't going to stop just because they'd crossed it. Ruth didn't say that out loud, but she could see in Celia's eyes that her daughter knew. They'd bought themselves time, maybe a few hours, maybe until morning. But that thing, whatever it was still out there, and it was patient. Ruth closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the rough wood of the wall. Her body ached in ways she'd almost forgotten were possible. Every old injury, every scar, every joint worn down by 71 years of hard labor screamed at her to stop, to rest, to give up. But she couldn't, not yet. Not while May was still shivering in Celia's arms, not while they were still so close to the Ashford place, not while something hunted them through the Texas night. She must have dozed off, because when she jerked awake, the rain had stopped and pale grey light was filtering through the cracks in the walls. Dawn. She'd slept longer than she'd meant to. Celia and May were still curled together under the blanket, both of them breathing the deep, slow breaths of true exhaustion. Ruth stood carefully, every muscle protesting, and moved to the door. She opened it a crack and peered out. The forest was shrouded in mist, thick and white and clinging to the ground like a living thing. The trees were barely visible beyond 10 feet. She couldn't hear anything except the steady drip of water from the leaves. No birds, no insects, no sounds of movement. The silence felt wrong, heavy and expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. Ruth stepped outside, knife in hand, and scanned the clearing around the shack. Nothing moved in the mist, but there, at the edge of the clearing where the trees began, were tracks, fresh tracks, pressed into the mud, leading right up to the door of the shack and then circling around it, slow and deliberate, as if whatever made them had been pacing the perimeter all night, studying the structure, studying them inside. Ruth crouched down and examined the tracks more closely. They were not human. They were not animal either, at least not any animal she recognized. They were too large, the impressions too deep, and the shape was wrong, elongated and splayed in a way that made her skin crawl. She stood up slowly, gripping the knife tighter, and turned in a slow circle. The tracks circled the shack completely, forming a perfect ring. Then they led off into the forest to the north, disappearing into the mist. Whatever had made them had left, but only recently. The tracks were still filling with water from the overnight rain. Ruth went back inside and shook Celia awake. Celia jerked upright, eyes wild with panic, until she remembered where she was. Ruth told her quietly that they needed to leave now, that something had been here during the night, that it knew where they were. Celia looked down at May, still asleep, her small face peaceful in a way it hadn't been when she was awake. Celia asked how much time they had. Ruth said she didn't know. Maybe an hour, maybe less. They needed to move while the mist gave them cover, needed to put more distance between themselves and whatever was following them. Celia nodded and gently shook May awake. The girl's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and glazed with exhaustion. Celia told her they were leaving, that she needed to get up. May whimpered but obeyed, letting her mother pull her to her feet. They stepped outside into the cold morning mist, and Ruth showed them the tracks. Celia stared at them for a long moment, then looked at Ruth and asked what could have made them. Ruth said she didn't know, and that was the truth. In all her years, all her running, all her time in the woods and swamps and wild places of the South, she'd never seen anything like these tracks. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever made them wasn't natural, and it wasn't going to stop following them until it got what it wanted. They started walking north, following the only clear path through the dense forest, moving as quickly as they dared in the mist. Ruth led, Celia and May close behind, all of them glancing over their shoulders every few steps. The mist muffled their footsteps and swallowed the world beyond a few feet in every direction, turning the forest into a maze of grey shapes and shifting shadows. It was disorienting, terrifying, but it also hid them, and Ruth was grateful for that. They walked for what felt like hours, though it was hard to judge time in the mist. Eventually the ground began to rise, the trees thinning slightly, and they found themselves climbing a low hill. At the top, Ruth called a halt. They stood there, breathing hard, and looked back the way they'd come. Through gaps in the mist, they could see the river far below, a silver thread cutting through the green. And on the far side of the river, barely visible through the trees, was the Ashford place. From up here, it looked small, harmless, just another cluster of buildings in an endless landscape. But Ruth knew better. She knew that right now Thomas Ashford was probably standing in the yard, staring at the empty shack where 3 women used to live, his face twisted with rage. She knew that he was probably saddling horses, gathering men, preparing to come after them. And she knew that even if they outran the Ashfords, even if they made it to Louisiana, even if they found Ruth's distant family in safety, they would still have to deal with the thing that had circled their shelter in the night, the thing whose tracks led north, the same direction they were going. Celia asked Ruth if she thought the Ashfords would come after them. Ruth said yes, absolutely, that men like the Ashfords didn't let their property walk away without a fight, even if the law said that property was actually people. But, she added, the Ashfords were the least of their worries right now. Celia asked what she meant. Ruth pointed down at the ground. There, pressed into the soft earth at the top of the hill, were more of those strange tracks, fresh, leading north, leading exactly where they were going. May saw them too and made a small frightened sound. She asked in a trembling voice what was following them. Ruth crouched down and put her hands on May's shoulders and looked into the girl's eyes and said she didn't know. But whatever it was, they were going to stay ahead of it. They were going to keep moving, keep fighting, keep surviving, because that was what their family did. They survived. May nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, and Ruth pulled her into a fierce hug. Over the girl's head, Ruth met Celia's eyes, and in that look, past an understanding, they both knew this wasn't going to end well. They both knew that something was hunting them, something that didn't follow the rules of the natural world, something that wanted them for reasons they couldn't understand. But they also knew they had no choice but to keep going, because the only other option was to stop, and stopping meant dying. So they would walk, they would run, they would fight. And if the thing in the mist finally caught them, they would face it together. 3 generations of women who'd survived slavery and war and hatred, and who sure as hell weren't going to go down without making it bleed. They descended the hill and walked deeper into the forest, the mist beginning to lift as the sun climbed higher. By mid-morning, they'd left the river miles behind, and were moving through country that grew wilder with every step. The pines gave way to hardwoods, oak and hickory and elm, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even in full daylight the forest floor remained dim and shadowed. The underbrush thinned in places, making walking easier, but it also made them more visible, more exposed. Ruth kept them moving at a steady pace, not running but not dawdling either, always listening for the sounds of pursuit from behind, or the sounds of something moving parallel to them in the trees. The tracks they'd seen at the top of the hill had disappeared into harder ground, but Ruth had no doubt the thing that made them was still out there, still following, still patient. May was flagging. The girl's legs were shorter than theirs, her body weaker from hunger and cold and fear. She stumbled more often, caught herself on trees, dragged her feet. Celia tried to carry her, but Celia herself was exhausted, and after a few minutes she had to put May down. Ruth called a halt in a small clearing where a fallen log provided a place to sit. They shared the last of the ruined cornbread and drank from a creek they'd crossed a mile back. the water cold and metallic tasting, but clean enough. May asked how much further they had to go. Ruth said she didn't know exactly. Maybe another 50 miles to the Louisiana border, maybe more. May's face crumpled, and for a moment, Ruth thought the girl was going to cry again, but instead, May set her jaw, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and said she could make it. Ruth felt something fierce and proud swell in her chest. This child, born into a world that had never wanted her to exist, that had spent every day of her short life trying to break her, was choosing to keep walking. That was strength. That was survival. That was everything Ruth had fought for across 71 years, condensed into one 11-year-old girl who refused to quit. They rested for 10 minutes, no more, and then started walking again. The forest changed as the day wore on. The trees grew larger, older, their trunks wider than 3 people holding hands could encircle. The ground was carpeted in thick moss that muffled their footsteps. Vines hung from branches like curtains, and in places the canopy opened up enough to let shafts of sunlight through, illuminating floating dust motes and making the whole forest feel cathedral-like, ancient and holy, and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath its branches. It was beautiful. It was also deeply unsettling, because beauty like this usually came with a price, and Ruth had learned long ago that the most dangerous places were often the prettiest ones. They were crossing through one of those sun-dappled clearings, moving single file with Ruth in the lead when she heard it, a sound she'd been dreading since they left the Ashford place. Dogs, faint but unmistakable, baying in the distance behind them. Ruth froze, holding up a hand to stop Celia and May. All 3 of them stood perfectly still, listening. The baying came again, closer this time, echoing through the trees. At least 3 dogs, maybe more, and where there were dogs, there were men. The Ashfords had come. Ruth's mind raced. They couldn't outrun horses and dogs, not in open forest like this. They needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere the dogs couldn't follow. Or they needed to do something to break the trail. Water would help, but the nearest creek was a mile back, and going back meant running straight into the Ashfords. Ruth scanned the clearing, looking for anything, any advantage. Her eyes landed on a thick stand of brambles at the far edge, a tangled mass of thorns and vines that looked impenetrable. She pointed at it and told Celia and May to get in there, to crawl as deep as they could, to cover themselves with leaves and mud, and not make a sound no matter what they heard. Celia stared at the brambles, then at Ruth, and asked what Ruth was going to do. Ruth said she was going to lead the dogs away, give Celia and May time to hide properly, then circle back and find them later. Celia grabbed Ruth's arm, fingers digging in hard enough to hurt, and said, no, they weren't splitting up. That was how people got lost and never found each other again. Ruth met her daughter's eyes and said firmly that if they all stayed together, the dogs would find all of them, and then none of them would make it out. But if Ruth could draw the Ashfords off, even for a little while, Celia and May might have a chance. May was crying now, silently, tears streaming down her face. She whispered that she didn't want Grandma Ruth to go. Ruth crouched down and cupped May's face in her weathered hands and told her that this was what family did. They protected each other. They made sacrifices, and sometimes that meant one person had to run so the others could hide. She kissed May's forehead, then stood and looked at Celia. She told her daughter that if she wasn't back by nightfall, Celia should keep moving north without her, that she should find Ruth's cousin Esther in Shreveport and tell her what happened. Celia's jaw trembled, but she nodded. Ruth turned and ran before either of them could argue further, before she could change her mind, before the fear could catch up with her. She ran east, deliberately making noise, snapping branches, disturbing leaves, leaving a trail a blind man could follow. Behind her, she heard Celia and May crashing into the brambles, and then the forest swallowed the sound. The dogs' baying grew louder. Ruth kept running, her old legs burning, her lungs screaming, but she didn't stop. She ran until she burst out of the trees onto the bank of another creek, this one wider and faster than the last. She splashed into it without hesitation, wading upstream, letting the water erase her scent, buying precious minutes. She heard the dogs reach the spot where she'd entered the water. They milled around on the bank, confused, baying in frustration. Men's voices shouted, harsh and angry. Ruth recognized Thomas Ashford's voice, cursing her, promising what he'd do when he caught her. She kept moving upstream, her skirts dragging heavy in the current, her feet numb from the cold. After what felt like a mile but was probably less, she climbed out on the opposite bank and stood there, dripping and gasping, listening. The dogs had picked up the trail again. They were coming. Ruth smiled grimly. Good. Let them come. Let them chase her through this forest until their horses collapsed and their lungs gave out. As long as they were chasing her, they weren't chasing Celia and May. She started running again, north now, angling away from where she'd left her daughter and granddaughter hidden. The forest blurred around her, green and brown and shadow. Her heart hammered, her vision narrowed. She ran until she couldn't run anymore, until her legs gave out, and she collapsed against a tree, chest heaving, black spots dancing at the edges of her sight. The dog sounded closer, much closer. Ruth forced herself to stand, to keep moving, but her body wouldn't obey. She'd pushed it too hard, asked too much of muscles and bones that were decades past their prime. She sank back down, back against the rough bark, knife in her hand, and waited. If this was where it ended, so be it. She'd lived longer than most people born into slavery ever got to live. She'd survived things that should have killed her 100 times over, and she'd bought her daughter and granddaughter time. That was worth dying for. The first dog burst through the underbrush, a big brindled hound with slobber flying from its jaws. It skidded to a stop 10 feet from Ruth, hackles raised, growling low in its throat. Behind it came 2 more dogs, and behind them came Thomas Ashford on horseback, flanked by 2 other white men Ruth didn't recognize. Thomas's face was flushed red with exertion and rage. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, pulling a coiled whip from his saddle. He walked toward Ruth, boots crunching on the forest floor, and stopped just out of reach of her knife. He said she'd made a big mistake running, that he was going to make an example of her that every black person in Grimes County would remember for the next 50 years. Ruth spat at his feet and told him to go to hell. Thomas's smile widened. He raised the whip, and then, from somewhere behind the men, came a sound that made everyone freeze. It wasn't the sound of dogs or horses or men. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound that vibrated in the chest and set teeth on edge. The dogs whimpered and pressed themselves to the ground, ears flat. The horses stamped and rolled their eyes. Thomas turned slowly, whip forgotten, and stared into the forest. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the thing stepped out from between the trees. Ruth saw it clearly for the first time, and her breath caught in her throat. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with a body that seemed wrong in every proportion, too long in the limbs, too broad in the shoulders, covered in something that might have been fur or might have been shadow, she couldn't tell. Its face was the worst part, almost human but not quite. The features stretched and distorted like a reflection in warped glass. Its eyes were pale, milky white, and they fixed on Thomas Ashford with an intensity that made the man take an involuntary step backward. The thing's mouth opened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many, and it made that sound again, that low, terrible growl that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight to the primitive lizard part of the brain that knew what it meant to be prey. Thomas raised the whip with shaking hands and shouted at the thing to get back, that he'd shoot it if it came any closer. One of the other men had drawn a pistol and was pointing it at the creature, but his hands were shaking so badly Ruth doubted he could hit the broad side of a barn. The thing took another step forward. The dogs broke and ran, disappearing into the forest with their tails between their legs. The horses screamed and reared, nearly throwing their riders, and Thomas Ashford, who'd spent his entire life terrorizing people he considered less than human, finally understood what it felt like to be on the other side of that equation. The thing lunged. It moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move, closing the distance between itself and Thomas in less than a heartbeat. Thomas screamed and swung the whip, but the creature batted it aside like it was nothing and wrapped one massive hand around his throat, lifting him off the ground as easily as Ruth might lift a child. The other 2 men fired their pistols, the shots deafeningly loud in the quiet forest. But if the bullets hit the creature, it didn't seem to notice or care. It turned its head and looked at them, and that look was enough. They broke and ran, abandoning Thomas, abandoning their horses, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Ruth watched, frozen, as the creature held Thomas up, studying him the way a child might study an insect before pulling off its wings. Thomas thrashed and kicked, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging. Then, almost gently, the creature tossed him aside. Thomas hit a tree with a sickening crunch and slid to the ground, not moving. The creature turned its attention to Ruth. She gripped her knife tighter, knowing it was useless, knowing she was about to die, but determined to go down fighting. But the creature didn't attack. It just stood there looking at her with those strange milky eyes. And then it spoke. Its voice was rough, unused, like rocks grinding together. But the words were clear enough. It said, "Run." Ruth didn't need to be told twice. She pushed herself to her feet and ran, not looking back, not questioning, just moving as fast as her old legs would carry her. Behind her, she heard the creature moving through the forest, but it wasn't chasing her. It was heading in a different direction, back toward where the other two men had fled. Ruth ran until she couldn't hear anything but her own ragged breathing and the pounding of her heart, and then she kept running, because fear was fuel, and she wasn't out of fuel yet. She found Celia and May just before dark, still hidden in the brambles where she'd left them. When they saw Ruth stumbling toward them, alive and relatively unharmed, they burst out crying and threw their arms around her. Ruth held them both, her body shaking with exhaustion and shock, and told them they needed to keep moving, that the Ashfords were gone, but something else was out here, something that had saved her life for reasons she didn't understand, and probably never would. Celia asked what it was. Ruth said she didn't know, but it had told her to run, and she wasn't about to ignore advice from something that could rip a man apart with its bare hands. They gathered their few belongings and started walking again, moving north through the gathering darkness. 3 generations of women fleeing slavery and terror, and something far stranger than either, refusing to stop, refusing to give up, because that was what survival looked like, and survival was all they had left. 3 women running from slavery in 1884 Texas just discovered that some things in the dark are more dangerous than any slave catcher, but some things might be on their side. Subscribe to see how this impossible journey ends. Like if this story is keeping you up tonight, comment which moment scared you most and share this, because sometimes the monsters aren't who you think they are. They walked through the night, too afraid to stop, too afraid that stopping would mean never starting again. The forest changed around them as the hours passed, the hardwoods giving way to pine again, then to a strange mixed woodland where cypress trees rose from standing water, and the ground beneath their feet became spongy and unreliable. Ruth led them along the driest paths she could find, but more than once they sank ankle-deep in mud that sucked at their shoes and made every step an effort. May had stopped complaining hours ago, had stopped talking altogether, moving like a small ghost through the dark, her hand locked in Celia's with a grip that never loosened. Celia herself walked in a kind of trance, putting one foot in front of the other mechanically, her eyes glazed and distant. Ruth knew they couldn't keep this pace much longer. The human body had limits, and they were approaching theirs. But every time she thought about stopping, she remembered Thomas Ashford's body crumpled at the base of that tree, remembered the creature's pale eyes studying her, remembered that single word, run. So she kept walking, and they kept following, and the night stretched on until Ruth began to wonder if dawn would ever come, or if they'd somehow slipped into a place where time moved differently, where night lasted forever. Dawn came eventually, creeping in grey and cold through the trees. With the light came a new landscape. The forest thinned, the trees growing smaller and more scattered, and through the gaps, Ruth could see open country ahead, rolling hills covered in tall grass and wildflowers. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way, but it also meant they'd be exposed, visible for miles to anyone looking for them. Ruth called a halt at the edge of the trees and studied the open country, weighing their options. They could skirt along the forest edge, staying in cover, but that would take longer and tire them out even more. Or they could cut straight across the open ground, faster but riskier. She was still trying to decide when May pointed and said in a small, hoarse voice that she saw smoke. Ruth followed the girl's finger and spotted it, a thin column of grey rising from behind a low hill, maybe 2 miles to the northeast. Smoke meant people. People meant food, water, maybe shelter. It also meant danger, because not everyone in East Texas in 1884 was friendly to 3 black women traveling alone. But they were out of food, nearly out of water, and so exhausted that Ruth knew they wouldn't make it another day without help. She made the decision and told Celia and May they were going to approach whoever was making that fire carefully and see if they were the helping kind or the killing kind. They moved out of the trees and into the open grassland, the morning sun warm on their backs, the grass brushing against their legs with every step. It felt strange to be out in the open after so long in the forest's shadows, exposed and vulnerable, but also oddly freeing. Ruth kept them moving at a steady pace, not running, not trying to hide, just 3 travelers walking toward smoke and whatever waited there. As they crested the hill, the source of the smoke came into view. A small homestead, a single-room cabin with a stone chimney, a pen with a few chickens, a vegetable garden and a well. Sitting on the porch was an old black man, probably in his 70s, with hair gone completely white and skin weathered to the color of old leather. He was whittling something, a piece of wood slowly taking shape in his gnarled hands. He looked up as they approached, his eyes sharp despite his age, and watched them walk into his yard. Ruth raised one hand in greeting, the universal gesture of peaceful intent, and called out that they meant no harm, that they were just travelers in need of water and maybe a bite of food if he could spare it. The old man studied them for a long moment, his knife still moving over the wood in his hands, then nodded toward the well and said they were welcome to drink their fill. They drank like they'd been lost in the desert for a week, hauling up bucket after bucket of cold, sweet water and pouring it over their heads, into their mouths, washing away days of mud and sweat and fear. The old man watched them without comment, then went inside and came back out with a plate of cornbread and a jar of honey. He set it on the porch rail and told them to help themselves. They ate standing up, too hungry and too wary to sit, tearing into the cornbread like animals. When they'd finished, Ruth thanked him and asked his name. He said it was Moses, which made Ruth smile despite everything, because of course it was. She introduced herself and Celia and May, and Moses nodded as if he'd been expecting them. He asked where they were coming from and where they were headed. Ruth hesitated, not sure how much to tell him, but something in the old man's eyes made her decide on the truth. She said they were running from the Ashford place in Grimes County, that they'd been living under sharecropping that was slavery by another name, and that they were trying to make it to Louisiana where Ruth had family. Moses nodded again, unsurprised, and said he knew the Ashfords by reputation, that they were bad people who'd gotten away with bad things for a long time. He asked if the Ashfords were following them. Ruth said they had been, but something had happened, something she couldn't quite explain, and she thought the pursuit had ended. Moses's eyes sharpened, and he asked what kind of something. Ruth described the creature, the impossible thing she'd seen in the forest, the thing that had killed Thomas Ashford, and told her to run. Moses went very still. His knife stopped moving. He set the piece of wood down carefully on the porch rail and looked at Ruth with an expression she couldn't read. He asked if the thing had pale eyes, if it moved like smoke, if its voice sounded like stones grinding. Ruth felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up and said yes. That was exactly what it was like. Moses stood up slowly, his joints creaking, and motioned for them to follow him inside. The cabin was small but clean, a single room with a fireplace, a narrow bed, a table, and shelves lined with jars and books. Moses went to one of the shelves and pulled down a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. He opened it and showed Ruth a drawing, crude but effective, of something that looked disturbingly like the creature she'd seen. Beneath the drawing were words in faded ink. Moses said the journal had belonged to his grandfather, who'd been a root worker back in Georgia before the war. His grandfather had written about things he'd seen and heard, old things, things that existed long before white people came to this land, things that the enslaved had brought with them from Africa, or that had been here waiting, older than nations, older than empires. The creature Ruth had seen had a name in his grandfather's journal. They called it the Haunt. It wasn't a ghost and it wasn't a demon exactly, but something in between, something that fed on guilt and fear and the suffering of the innocent. And it had a particular hatred for those who caused that suffering. Ruth asked why it had helped her, why it had killed Thomas Ashford instead of killing her. Moses said his grandfather's journal suggested the Haunt could sense intent, could tell the difference between someone running toward violence and someone running from it. It didn't help everyone. Sometimes it just watched. Sometimes it killed without discrimination. But every once in a while it chose sides, and when it did, it was a force of nature, unstoppable and terrible. Ruth asked if it was still following them. Moses said he didn't know, that the Haunt did what it wanted, went where it wanted, but if it had told her to run, that was probably a good sign. It meant she was under its protection, at least for now. How long that protection would last, he couldn't say. Celia, who'd been listening quietly, asked if they were in danger from it. Moses shrugged and said danger was relative. The Haunt killed people, yes, but mostly people who deserved killing. As long as they kept moving, kept doing right by each other, kept surviving, they'd probably be fine. Probably. That wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was better than nothing. Ruth thanked Moses for the food and the water and the information. She asked if he knew the best route to Louisiana from here. Moses said there was an old trader's road about 5 miles northeast that ran all the way to Shreveport. It wasn't used much anymore since the railroad came through, but it was still passable. If they followed it, they'd reach the Louisiana border in 3 or 4 days, assuming they didn't run into trouble. He also warned them to stay off the main roads, that there were still men in these parts who made their living catching runaways, even though slavery was officially over. The law said one thing, but the land said another, and out here the land's voice was louder. They rested at Moses's cabin for a few hours, sleeping in shifts in the shade of his porch while he kept watch. when the sun was high and they'd recovered some of their strength, Ruth roused Celia and May and told them it was time to go. Moses gave them more cornbread wrapped in cloth, refilled their canteen, and pointed them toward the Traders' Road. He told them to be careful, to trust their instincts, and to remember that they'd already survived the hardest part. Everything from here on out was just walking. Ruth wasn't sure she believed that, but she appreciated the sentiment. They said their goodbyes and set off across the grassland, moving northeast toward the road Moses had described. May walked between Ruth and Celia now, holding both their hands, her small face set with determination. She'd stopped crying. She'd stopped asking how much further. She'd become, over the course of 3 days and 2 nights, someone older than her years, someone who understood that survival wasn't a guarantee, but a choice you made every morning when you woke up and decided to keep going. Ruth saw that understanding in the girl's eyes and felt a complicated mix of pride and grief. May should have been allowed to stay a child longer, but the world they lived in didn't allow black children that luxury. It never had. They found the Traders' Road by late afternoon, a rutted dirt track cutting through the grassland and disappearing into a line of trees on the horizon. It was overgrown in places, weeds pushing up through the packed earth, but it was still clearly a road, still something humans had made and used. They turned northeast and started walking, falling into the rhythm they'd developed over the past few days. Ruth in front, watching for danger, Celia in the middle, watching May in the back, watching the ground so she didn't trip. The sun moved across the sky. The grassland gave way to scrubby pine forest again. They saw no one, heard nothing but wind and birds, and their own footsteps. It felt almost peaceful, which made Ruth nervous. Peace was usually the calm before something terrible, and she kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as the day wore on and nothing happened, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. The road led them through a shallow valley where a creek ran alongside the track, and they stopped to drink and rest. Celia washed May's face and hands, tended to the girl's blistered feet, and re-wrapped the scratch on her leg that had mostly healed, but still looked angry and red. Ruth sat on a rock and stared back the way they'd come, listening for sounds of pursuit. She heard nothing. No dogs, no horses, no men, and no sign of the haunt, though she could feel it out there somewhere, watching from the trees or the shadows, or whatever place such things lived when they weren't killing slave catchers in East Texas forests. She wondered if it would follow them all the way to Louisiana, or if there was some invisible boundary it wouldn't cross. She wondered if Thomas Ashford's death had satisfied whatever hunger or purpose drove it, or if it would keep killing until there was no one left to kill. Mostly, though, she just wondered if they were going to make it through one more day without something trying to take them down. They made camp that night, in a hollow off the road, hidden from view by a thick stand of bushes. They didn't risk a fire, just huddled together under the single blanket and ate cold cornbread and tried to sleep. May dropped off almost immediately, exhausted beyond measure. Celia followed soon after, her head resting on Ruth's shoulder. Ruth stayed awake, watching the darkness, listening to the night sounds, her hand resting on the knife at her belt. She thought about Moses and his grandfather's journal, about the haunt and its pale eyes, about Thomas Ashford dying in the forest, and the 2 men who'd run away and probably told everyone in Grimes County that the woods were haunted, that there were monsters out there worse than any runaway slave. She thought about how stories like that would spread, how they'd keep other men from coming after escapees, how fear of the unknown was sometimes the best protection, and she thought about May sleeping peacefully now despite everything, and about how this girl would grow up knowing that her family had fought for her, had run for her, had survived for her. That was a legacy worth more than any amount of land or money or safety. That was what freedom actually meant, not the absence of chains, but the presence of people willing to break them for you. Ruth closed her eyes and let herself drift, just for a moment, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow they'd wake up and keep walking, and the day after that, they'd do it again. And eventually, if the world was kind and the haunt stayed on their side, they'd cross that border into Louisiana and start building a life that belonged to them. That was worth running for. That was worth everything. They reached the Louisiana border on the 4th day. There was no sign marking it, no fence or gate, just a subtle change in the landscape where the Texas grassland gave way to Louisiana's denser forests, and the air grew heavier with moisture from the bayous that sprawled somewhere to the south. Ruth felt it more than saw it, a shift in the world's weight, a sense of crossing from one kind of danger into another, hopefully lesser one. She stopped at the top of a low rise and looked back at Texas, at the land that had tried to kill them, and felt nothing. No relief, no triumph, just exhaustion and a grim determination to keep moving until they found Esther in Shreveport and could finally stop. Celia stood beside her, one hand shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun, and asked if Ruth thought they were safe now. Ruth said no, they wouldn't be safe until they were off the roads entirely, until they were hidden among people who'd protect them, until they'd put enough distance between themselves and the Ashford place that no one would bother looking anymore. But they were safer than they'd been 3 days ago, and that was something. May tugged on Ruth's skirt and asked if they could rest soon. Ruth looked down at the girl's pale, exhausted face and nodded. Yes, they could rest. They'd find Esther, and then they'd rest for as long as they needed. The road to Shreveport took them through country that grew progressively more populated. They passed farmsteads and small settlements, places where people looked at them with curiosity but not hostility, places where being black and traveling didn't automatically mean you were running from something. Louisiana had its own demons, its own systems of oppression and violence, but it also had communities of free black folks who'd built lives in the spaces between the white world's rules, and those communities had networks, ways of helping people like Ruth and Celia and May find their footing. They slept in a barn the first night after crossing the border, with the permission of a black farmer who fed them and didn't ask questions. The second night, they stayed with a family who ran a small general store and who'd heard through the grapevine that 3 women were making their way north from Texas. News traveled fast in certain circles, carried by people who understood that helping runaways, even in 1884 when slavery was supposed to be dead, was both a moral obligation and a practical necessity. The third night they reached Shreveport, a bustling river town where steamboats still churned up and down the Red River, and where the streets were crowded enough that 3 more black faces went unnoticed. Ruth asked at a church on the edge of town about Esther, describing her cousin as she remembered her from 30 years earlier. And the pastor smiled and said yes, he knew Esther. Everyone knew Esther. She ran a boarding house on the north side and took in people who needed help. He gave them directions, and as the sun set, they walked through Shreveport's dusty streets until they found the house, a 2-story structure that had seen better days, but was clean and well kept, with flower boxes in the windows and a sign that read, "Rooms available." Ruth knocked. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s, heavy-set and strong-looking, with grey streaking through her hair and eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes widened when they landed on Ruth, and for a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Esther said Ruth's name like a question, like she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Ruth said yes, it was her, and she'd brought her daughter and granddaughter, and they needed help. Esther didn't ask for explanations. She just pulled Ruth into a fierce hug, then ushered all 3 of them inside, sat them down at a kitchen table, and started pulling food from shelves and cupboards, assembling a meal with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. She told them they could stay as long as they needed, that she had rooms upstairs that weren't being used, that Shreveport was a good place to disappear if you needed to, that there were jobs here for people willing to work, that May could go to school at the church, that they were safe now, that they'd made it. Ruth wanted to believe her. Part of her did believe her, but another part, the part that had been forged in decades of running and hiding and surviving, knew that safety was always temporary. That freedom was something you had to defend every single day, that the world was full of people who'd take it from you if you let your guard down. But for tonight, in Esther's kitchen with hot food and warm light and family around her, Ruth let herself pretend. She let herself imagine that this was the end of the story, that they'd run far enough and fought hard enough and survived long enough that they'd earned the right to stop. Over the next few weeks, they settled into life in Shreveport. Esther gave them the 2 rooms on the top floor of the boarding house, small but private, with real beds and windows that locked and doors that only they had keys to. Celia found work as a seamstress, mending clothes for white families who paid in cash and didn't ask questions. May started attending classes at the church school, learning to read and write properly for the first time in her life, soaking up knowledge like she'd been starved for it. Ruth helped Esther run the boarding house, cooking and cleaning, and managing the handful of lodgers who came and went. It was hard work, but it was work they chose, work they got paid for, work they could stop doing if they wanted to. That made all the difference. They began to build something that resembled a normal life, the kind of life Ruth had only ever seen white people have, the kind where you woke up in the morning and didn't immediately start calculating how to survive the day. It felt strange, it felt fragile, but it felt real. May began to smile again, to laugh, to act like an 11-year-old instead of a war survivor. Celia's face lost some of its hard edges, her shoulders unhunching, her voice regaining a lightness that Ruth had thought was gone forever. And Ruth herself, against all odds, began to sleep through the night without waking up at every sound, without reaching for her knife, without planning escape routes from every room she entered. But the haunt never left her mind entirely. She thought about it often, especially at night when the boarding house was quiet, and she lay in bed listening to the sounds of Shreveport outside her window. She thought about Thomas Ashford dying in the forest, about the creature's pale eyes studying her, about that single word, run. She wondered if it was still out there, stalking through the Texas woods, hunting men who hurt the innocent, or if it had moved on to other places, other victims. She wondered if it had saved her life because it saw something worth saving, or if she'd just been convenient, a tool it could use to punish someone it hated. She wondered if she'd ever see it again, and if that would be a good thing or a terrible one. Moses's grandfather's journal had said the haunt fed on guilt and fear and suffering, and Ruth had plenty of all three. But she also had May and Celia and Esther, and a life that was slowly, tentatively becoming something she could call her own. If the haunt came for her now, would it see that? Would it care? Or would it just see more fuel for whatever fire burned inside it? One night, about 2 months after they'd arrived in Shreveport, Ruth was walking back to the boarding house from the market when she felt it again, that prickling at the back of her neck, that sense of being watched. She stopped in the middle of the street and turned slowly, scanning the buildings and alleyways. The sun had just set, and the shadows were long and thick. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, in the mouth of an alley between two shops, something moved. It was there and gone in less than a heartbeat, but Ruth saw it clearly enough. The two long limbs, the pale eyes, the shape that didn't quite fit together right. The haunt. It had followed them. It was here in Shreveport. Ruth's hand went to her hip where she used to keep her knife, but she wasn't carrying it anymore. She'd stopped carrying it weeks ago, stopped feeling like she needed it. Now she regretted that decision. But the haunt didn't approach. It just stood there in the shadows watching her, and Ruth stood in the street watching it back. After a long moment, Ruth spoke, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. She said thank you for what it had done in the forest, for saving her life, for giving them time to run. She said she didn't know why it had helped them, but she was grateful. The haunt didn't respond, at least not with words, but it tilted its head slightly in a gesture that might have been acknowledgement, and then it stepped back further into the alley and disappeared. Ruth waited another minute, but it didn't reappear. She turned and walked the rest of the way to the boarding house, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She didn't tell Celia or May about what she'd seen. There was no point in frightening them, no point in making them look over their shoulders again when they just started to feel safe. But Ruth knew the haunt was out there somewhere in the city, watching them, and strangely, that knowledge didn't terrify her the way it should have. Instead, it felt almost like having a guardian, a dark, terrible angel keeping watch over them, making sure nothing else tried to drag them back into the life they'd escaped. Ruth didn't understand it. She didn't trust it, but she accepted it, the way she'd accepted every other impossible thing she'd survived in 71 years of living in a world that wanted her dead. If the haunt wanted to protect them, she wouldn't argue. If it wanted something else, well, she'd deal with that when the time came. For now she had work to do, a family to care for, and a life to build. The past was behind her, full of chains and terror and things that stalked through the dark. The future was ahead, uncertain but hers to shape, and that was enough. That was everything. Years later, after Ruth had passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 79, after Celia had raised May into a woman who went on to become a teacher, and then a principal at the church school, after May had her own children and told them the story of how 3 generations of women had walked out of Texas with nothing but each other and had survived impossible odds, the legend of the haunt persisted in East Texas. People still told stories about it, about the thing in the woods that killed slave catchers and protected runaways, about how it had been seen as late as the 1930s by people who swore they weren't making it up. Some said it was a ghost, the collective rage of everyone who died in chains given form and purpose. Others said it was something older, something that had been in the land before humans came and would be there long after they were gone. Ruth never told anyone the full truth of what had happened in that forest in 1884, never described exactly what she'd seen or what it had done. She kept that secret locked inside her, a gift she gave to the haunt in exchange for the gift it had given her: life, freedom, and the chance to watch her granddaughter grow up in a world where she could choose her own path. That was worth keeping a secret for. That was worth everything. Three generations escaped slavery in 1884 Texas, with something dark and impossible protecting them from the shadows, proving that sometimes the monsters aren't the villains, and sometimes survival requires accepting help from forces we'll never understand. Subscribe for more true stories from history's darkest corners, like if this journey kept you on edge, and comment what you think the haunt really was, because this story happened. The women were real,